Well, that wraps up the mini topics, which means we're moving on, Dave, quite quickly to our premiere event of this episode, which is the Holy Terror.
Yeah, so we don't talk about Big Finish much on this show, so we're going to have a quick generic talk to start. We'll probably wrap up with a bit of a generic talk, but we put out there 4 big finishes for us to watch. I picked 2 purely based on, I'd like to hear that, Doctor, and that looks like a cool monster and a good cover. I'll put that on, and was fairly quickly torn apart by people who know what they're talking about, and I think the results reflect that. You, on the other hand, Rob, know a bit more about Big Finish and were a bit more canny in your picks, and,
yes.
Landslide win to you with first and second place, but I'll let you do the results.
Thank you very much. Yes, we had well over 100 votes, which was great because I know not everyone listens to Big Finish. I've certainly been spruiking it though on the channel saying, look, this is for free on Spotify if you want to go and listen to it. So hopefully some people out there have taken the chance to listen to it on Spotify. Although I think we might have even found some new listeners through putting that poll out there because people certainly got involved. The Holy Terror one with 39.6. That was my first pick.
That's not a bad set of. That's not a bad vote for a 4-way race.
I know, but the second one of mine, the One Doctor, got 36.8, so it wasn't very far behind.
No.
Which means, Dave, that Return of the Crotons, which you picked, 16%, and Planet of the Witches, which I think several people were saying, that is just awful. Why would you pick that? And quite rightly, you're saying, well, I've not heard it. I just thought it looked good. Got 7.5%.
Yes, so look, if I'm tempted to go and listen to some of the Tom Baker Season 18 stories, I won't. Start with Planet of the Witches.
No, I would not probably listen to that at all.
No, so the Holy Terror did win.
Yes. So, where shall we start? Perhaps some thoughts, rough thoughts on Big Finish, our first memories of it, and all of that, just to set the scene for people who've not heard us talk about Big Finish, because we don't really talk about it all that often.
Yeah, so look, I can certainly remember being in fandom in July 1999 when the Sirens of Time came out, and I was thinking about why I didn't get into Big Finish at the time, and I've actually got 4 reasons that I came up with, and the first was simply that I was sort of moving out of fandom by that stage. The telemovie had happened in 96, and that had flopped in a commercial sense. There was no new series. The Virgin books had sort of moved on, or had gone, and I was sort of getting out of organised fandom to a certain extent. Reason number 2, they were expensive. By the time you got them out to Australia, you were talking at least the price of a proper DVD, if not more, which didn't appeal to me very much at all as a uni student at the time. One of the big things was I had nowhere to play them, in that my car at the stage only had a cassette player, and the only way to put a CD on cassette was to sit there and actually, in real time, have it play out, make sure you change the tape over it, and all the rest of it to the right side. And when you're talking a 2-hour plus Big Finish CD, that's 3 or 4 sides of tapes.
Oh, I was fancy, Dave. I had one of these adapters which was shaped like a cassette.
Oh,
and you would plug that in, and a wire came out of it, and you plug the wire into like a Discman or something, a Sony Discman, and away you went like that.
Yes, Richard actually had one of those very briefly at one stage. But look, so like even driving around, I didn't have the ability to play CDs, so I would spend a lot of money on something that I couldn't play in the car, and the other thing just was simply my friends weren't into it, so I kind of didn't get into Big Finish at the time. And the first Big Finish I heard was actually Spare Parts, and I remember that was June 2004 because a bunch of us went up to Mildura for the wedding of the man who would become Rob from 42 to Doomsday. And it's a 6-hour drive each way from Melbourne to Mildura. And on the trip back, one of the guys in the car, because we're all friends from Doctor Who fandom, he said, "Hey, I've got this CD of this Spare Parts story that like everybody's raving about. This will kill 2 hours of the trip. Let's listen to it." So that was my introduction to Big Finish. I've dipped in and out since then, but before I talk about what I have listened to, Rob, were you around? Were you listening to Big Finish in July 99, or did you come to it later?
Well, it's interesting because that's where you were getting out of fandom, whereas I was getting back into fandom. That's where I was sort of coming in with EDAs and things like that. And I was very intrigued by the idea of Big Finish. I was one of those weird kids, at least in Australian terms, who understood audio drama. You know, it's a much bigger thing in the UK.
Yeah, it is.
You know, I think like on radio and stuff, people will still listen to audio dramas, whereas here it's not been a thing probably since, God knows, the 50s maybe, or something like that. You know, I think it rapidly fell away in Australia after a while, probably once TV came in. But when they first came out, Mark, my friend, who was our local fan club president, not the New South Wales club, but like the local area club. I mean, our local area club hadn't existed at that time for maybe 6 or 7 years, but he got some in. And I said to him, how is it? You know, what's it like? And he said, well, it's not very good. And I was like, oh. And that kind of coloured my opinion when I sat down. I went over to his place one weekend probably, or a Friday night or something, and I sat down and listened to the Sirens of Time. And I thought, yeah, you know, it's actually not that good. And that kind of coloured my perception a great deal. Now, more recently, I'm doing the great journey to listen to every monthly release. I've mentioned this on the show before. And I've got to say, at least half of the first 10 aren't that great at all. You know, even listening to them now with more mature ears, no pressure on me to like them or dislike them, just a completely open mind, I found half of that first 10 to be like, oh God, that's terrible. But then Big Finish goes on this wild tear for the next 20 or 30 releases, and most of them are really, really good. But I wasn't to know that, so I listened to these early ones, and I thought, I'm not into this. But what really got me into Big Finish was them signing McGann. I think by the following year, you've got McGann putting out stories. And I had really liked his Doctor in the TV movie. I thought the TV movie was horrible on the whole, but he was brilliant.
Yeah.
And I wanted to hear more from him. So just like you got into the NAs, this is going to continue Sylvester's story. And I had been reading EDAs. Now it was like, oh my God, I can actually hear McGann do stories. So I bought every single McGann release on CD, right up to the point of the box sets that started coming out whenever they started coming out. So I have got dozens of McGann stories here on CD, and I listened to all of those, and I thought he was a great and fabulous Doctor. But it wasn't until this more recent Great Journey that I've really started deep diving into the Collins stuff and the Sylvester stuff, and of course Davo. I'd heard a few Davos, but broadly I've been hearing in the last few months stuff I've never heard before, and some of it is very, very good.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you say that, because I can certainly remember Paul McGann signing to Big Finish being a big deal, even though I was very out of fandom by that stage. But it's funny you mentioned the Sirens of Time, because whilst I totally understand they wanted to make a splash with this big multi-Doctor story with Davo and Colin and Sylvester, I must admit looking at the cover of that and going, okay, so this is just fan fiction then, and maybe a bit of fan wank too. Like, okay, let's have a multi-Doctor story. Like, that was totally the wrong vibe to get cynical 19-year-old me in at the time.
Oh, look, I look at the Doctor Who comics they've put out in recent years, and it seems every second issue they're doing some sort of multi-Doctor thing, and I get cynical about that. So it still goes on.
So, look, anyway, I did sort of come to Big Finish and picked it up. What have I listened to? What have I enjoyed? So, look, no shock. I have loved and bought, I think, all of the Virgin adaptions, and some of them have been really, really good, and I've loved them. And listening to both New Adventure and Missing Adventure adaptions has been a lot of fun. I think that the things that I have mostly gravitated towards in Big Finish have been things that have a tangible link to the series I know. So adapting Virgin novels is one example. Adaptions of The Lost Season 23 I bought all of. Some were really good. Some were very interesting in that they were a adaptation that let me hear a story that itself wasn't good, but it was adapted well. Some were terrible. There's one that was so compromised, Hollows of Time, where, like, it's meant to basically have the Master in it, and they couldn't have the Master, and they couldn't have the Master's TARDIS, so they had a guy who's kind of like the Master in a car that's kind of like the Master's TARDIS that can dematerialise for no apparent reason. And it's like, it was just so compromised. You go, guys, no, you shouldn't have done this. And you listen to the doco at the end of it, and somebody says to Colin, like, you realise this guy was like a substitute Master, and Colin's like, have you recorded this story? You know, Colin's like, oh, that makes a lot more sense.
Oh my God.
So, you know, that wasn't the best, but again, really interesting. The same with the season 27 adaptation, which I know you and Mike Solko talked about once when I was on holiday. I enjoyed most of them. I've enjoyed the adaptation of the plays, Curse of the Daleks especially. Like, I get to hear Curse of the Daleks, a play from 1965 that I otherwise wouldn't hear. But I have dipped in and out of the monthly ones, and usually it's been because there's been a hook like, oh, that's a prequel to The Talons of Weng Chiang. That's a prequel to Snake Dance. That's a sequel to Robots of Death. And often probably walked away disappointed because I wanted them to be closer to the original that I knew. On the other hand, the standout that I can remember listening to is Blood Tide, which is a Colin Baker original, and that I went into with no expectations and actually have very good memories of. So that's really where I've been with Big Finish. I've dipped in. I've listened to a couple of the Toms. You know, when Tom came along, I said, look, I'll listen to one of his ones with Mary Tam. Okay, so that's what it sounds like. Oh, he's doing one with Lalla Ward. I'll listen to one of the ones with Lalla Ward. Oh, so that's how that sounds like, and that's how that goes. But I haven't gone and bought the whole lot. And the one thing I haven't done is Eddie McGann, which is a big hole in my experience.
Ooh. Well, before I get on to McGann, I'll just say Blood Tide, I think, is fabulous. I mean, you've got Charles Darwin, you've got the Sixth Doctor with Evelyn Smythe. It's a great story. I mean, it does tread the ground that most Silurian stories tread, but yeah, that is a good one, Dave. Good call on that one.
Oh, thank you.
But what have I consumed and enjoyed? Well, like I mentioned, I've heard all the McGann. I own all the McGann up to the box sets. Then it starts to get a bit spotty because I haven't been buying the box sets because they're a much bigger purchase sort of price to begin with, and so I've always been a bit standoffish with them. I know some of them are really good, but they seem to just throw them out there, and I just haven't kept up with that. But I've listened to all these monthly type stuff.
Right.
In terms of the monthly range itself, I'm heading into the 40s now, so I'm working between release 40 and 50. So I guess out of 275, that's not bad going so far.
And are these all first time for you, or are there some that you have heard before when they came out?
Mostly first time. I'd say 80% first time.
Yeah, right.
Because I have heard some random stuff, especially from later on in the monthly range, mostly Davo type stuff.
Yep.
But I've listened to also a fair few, what would you call them, side project type things, like Cyberman 1 and Cyberman 2. Which I thought were fantastic and free of actually having to have the Doctor in them. They seem to be all the more interesting for it. Do I go to a special Doctor Who hell for saying that? I don't know. But
No, I think it's a really good point, because I've listened to a couple of the Companion Chronicles as well, back before they started just recasting Doctors so they could have earlier stories. And, there was one that was just Maureen O'Brien just telling a story about her life in Troy after leaving the Doctor, and I thought that was a really sweet little story.
Yeah, well, these Cyberman mini-series are really good as well.
Okay.
I would recommend them to you. No qualms about it.
Okay. I have occasionally looked at the covers of them and gone, I'd be really interested in listening to those, and then I've looked at the price to buy all of them and gone, maybe when they're cheaper, which they probably are now, so that might be a good time to have a look.
Oh, yeah, there have been sales. They might have done a Cyberman theme sale a little while ago, and they were quite cheap during that. I'll keep an eye out for you.
Oh, thank you.
Now, of course, what we're here to talk about tonight is The Holy Terror, written by Rob Shearman. Let's talk about Rob Shearman a bit, because the first thing I think of when it comes to Rob Shearman, or Robert Shearman, he often calls himself Robert Shearman, I should say Robert, is that he's a lovely, lovely man. That's how he comes across.
Yes.
And do you know, Dave, he even retweeted our poll. We hadn't tagged him in the tweet. He had somehow found it. He doesn't follow us or anything, but he must have found it, or someone tipped him off to it, and he retweeted our poll that had his story in it. So thank you very much, Robert. That's lovely.
And given the winning margin was about 3 or 4 votes, could well have actually tipped the poll.
Yeah, right. Rob Shearman's own vote may have done that. But look, just in general, when you see him, he seems to be a very gentle, smart, kind sort of man. You think, yeah, I could be mates with him, and of course the second thing I think of when I think of Robert Shearman is that he wrote Dalek for Eccleston's first series, which in turn was based on Jubilee, which he'd written for Big Finish. And speaking of Big Finish, it is about 14 years, I noticed, since he last wrote for them, and he never did any more TV Doctor Who. He's one of those writers who, this will sound terrible, but not on Rob by any means, but I think he's good enough to get his own writing gigs and not have to write in someone else's universe, because he is a real talent. That's our loss in him not doing a lot of Doctor Who stuff these days, but it's literature's gain, because he's done some remarkable stuff. He's done this series, 3 books, called We All Hear Stories in the Dark, this massive 3-volume thing, where I think the theory is you can just read stories in any order, like just grab 1, 2 or 3, take it off to the loo, read a story in any order, and you'll get a different experience once you've read through all the stories if you read them in certain orders. Anyway, that's just what I've heard, and I thought, that sounds amazing. I'll have to do that one day. So, look, they're my thoughts on Rob Shearman. Lovely man and a real talent.
Yeah, look, I agree with everything you've said. Dalek is one of my favourite New Who stories. I'm a big fan of his writing. He does seem lovely in all the documentaries. He hosts a doco on the Space Museum DVD, which is really, really good, and he's really sweet about it. But yeah, look, I think that you're right. He also, I think, is somebody who, once he is able to be his own master, really embraced being his own master. And I think he said one of the reasons why he didn't go back to writing TV Who was just that process of doing 47 drafts with all sorts of people looking over your shoulder was not for him a process conducive to being creative, whereas locking yourself in your study and just writing a 1,000-page book that's, between you and your editor does stimulate him as a creator. So, fair enough.
Yeah. Well, look, this is where it gets interesting, Dave, because I have heard this story before, and I re-listened to it again for the episode. You had never heard it before, and we have not discussed this between ourselves. So I literally have no idea, as we get on to our first thoughts on the story, what you may have thought of this, whether you really liked it, really loved it, were indifferent to it. I'm intrigued to know, so I'm going to give you first bite on the cherry. Dave, first thoughts on this story?
Well, Rob, I'm going to do this in a very particular way, because as I was listening to the story and taking some notes, I made a summary note at the end of each episode. There's 4 episodes. So I've got 4 notes here of how I was going through the story, and I'm just going to read them to you. And I'm going to say these are a starting point only. So, part 1. Some interesting ideas and characters, but very slow. 37 minutes is a long time for an episode. It feels like a Collins story in many ways, especially the sound and music, and including the Doctor not turning up for over 20 minutes.
Yes.
Part 2. I'm curious about what is going on, and the acting is good, interesting, but it needs to shift up a gear fast. Part 3. Much better! ! Both plots really going strong now, some cool things happening, elements of scary, very keen to see how this ends.
Yeah.
Part 4. That wasn't too bad, but is that it?
Really?
So look, we will tease that out, because this is just a starting point. I will say there are a lot of positive things about this. My overall experience was positive, but I need to hammer home right now. 2 hours and 20 minutes is ridiculous. It is ill-disciplined. It is unnecessary. This would have been, in my view, a brilliant 90-minute story. The extra hour hurts this more than anything else.
Yeah, as I've been doing the Great Journey, I download like in batches of 5, and I see what's coming down the pipe, and I'll see like 2 hours 20, 2 hours 20, 2 hours, 2 hours 20, 2 hours 20, and I'll be like, oh my god, at least there's a 2-hour one in here. There are a lot of awfully long Big Finish stories at the start of Big Finish. Things get a lot better later on, and particularly when you get to box sets, you might have 4 stories that are an hour each or whatever. So I completely concur with you that it is too long. I am completely on board with you there. That's my opening gambit on length, at least. And
generally, Rob, look, I mean, you picked this, you nominated this. I take it you're a fan?
Yeah, look, when I first heard this and it started, I thought, oh, this is going to be a funny one, because you have these early scenes where they're going to execute Eugene Tacitus unless he recants. And they're like, you must recant. And he's like, oh, well, then I recant. And they're like, okay, oh, very good, just had to check, and it's all very chummy. And it's a huge parody of scenes where people are asked to recant in a movie and they often refuse. And you think to yourself, well, what would happen if they turned around here in this scene and said, oh sure, I recant. Absolutely. I'll change religion or, whatever's being asked of them.
Yes. And you've got, the wife who's quietly content with the husband's death and all that sort of thing. It is very, very sort of black humour and fun.
Yeah. And like I say, here we see that sort of stuff happen. And it makes a mockery of the whole process. You know, whether it's scenes like that in movies, whether it's religion as a whole, I think that's probably a big one. I quite liked that. And of course, as it goes on, and people, we are going to talk spoilers in this episode. We haven't talked about the spoiler curtain. Let's bring the spoiler curtain down.
Yep.
As it goes on, it starts taking these darker turns until we realise what's actually happening. And I quite like that too. It gave the story light and shade. To me, it's a very good story. But length, I'll go with you on length.
Yeah, look, I totally agree with you that it does very, very effectively shift gears from under you, and that's a really good thing. And you're right, you start off thinking it's one thing, and by the time you get to part 3, you're like, this has gone in a whole different direction. It's pacier, it's more exciting, it's darker, it's scarier, and the levity's kind of slowly been turned down. So that is a very effective piece of writing, I totally agree.
It is, of course, a Sixth Doctor story. I'm not sure how much Sixth Doctor Big Finish you've listened to. Colin got a hard deal on telly. You've probably heard that he does well on Big Finish. What did you think of Colin?
Look, I thought he was very good. I know that this is released in 2001, thereabouts, so it's still quite early Colin Big Finish. He hasn't really gone off in all the wild places with a whole lot of new companions and stuff that people tell me he does. So I don't think we're quite at the sort of the grand Big Finish Colin, but he was very, very good. He's a natural audio performer, and I thought his performance was well done. He plays off Frobisher really well, which is good to see. I thought it was interesting. His tone is very much season 23 Colin. It's Terror of the Vervoids Colin. It's Colin, a little bit world weary, but a little bit fun and kind of, excited and just sort of happy to, get involved. They're executing somebody. Oh, this will be fun to watch. It's that sort of Colin, but it is also very Saywood Colin in that, as I said, he doesn't actually arrive in the story until the 20-minute mark. He doesn't arrive at the location of the story for another little bit. He then isn't really engaged in the story until part 2. And although he nudges a few things along, he doesn't have a dramatic impact on the plot of the story either. So that's very Saywood Colin.
It is. You're quite right. And I hadn't actually had that thought, but all of what you say is true. I think Colin's very good in this, which is something that can be said for a ton of his Big Finish appearances. He's not nasty. He's a little bit pompous, but he's not up himself.
Yep.
And it comes across 100 times better than when he was on the telly. As you say, by Vervoids, he's kind of got it down, and he's maybe more what his Doctor should have been.
Yeah.
Here he genuinely wants to help people. He is, as many people say, what he could have been on TV with the right writing and direction. So I quite like him here. But you're right, he does get split up from Frobisher. And Frobisher probably gets one of the more interesting sort of storylines in this piece by being worshipped by the people in this castle.
Yeah, so let's talk about Frobisher, both him and his plot strand. Rollby went first on Colin. You go first on the Penguin.
Sure. I mean, Frobisher was this character in the Doctor Who magazine comic strip when I was just getting into fandom. This is like 1986. And I jumped into the magazine. I was like, oh, wow, look at this comic. Colin isn't with Perry. He's with this penguin. Oh, but he's not just a penguin. Oh, he's a shapeshifter. He's a whiffadil. And I can't remember if I ever assigned a voice to him in my head. I really can't. Or if the comic even gave cues as to how he would talk. But he's got this kind of wise guy American accent, not a full-on, you dirty rat kind of wise guy, but he's played by this Canadian called Robert Gizek, and I really like the performance and the voice he gives to Frobisher. As soon as I heard it, I thought, yep, that's Frobisher. This character I was reading in comics, 30-odd years ago, more than 30 years ago. I believe in him. I think that is perfect. So I quite liked how they did Frobisher.
Yeah, I was a big fan. I think it's probably one of the strengths, if not the strength, of the story. I do vaguely remember being about 6 and seeing Frobisher in some random Doctor Who magazine comics and being a bit baffled by it all, I must admit. And you say, what voice did I assign him? I think that private detective voice is probably where I went, but not necessarily a North American private detective. But it works so well. Look, he comes in, works well with Colin from the get-go. They have a good relationship. Colin is friendly to him, but also not quite on par with him all the time, which I think makes for a good companion dynamic. He's funny. He's got an eye for the ladies, but he's also quite sensible, and he's certainly very aware of his own self-preservation, which is a unusual characteristic for a companion, and probably a quite welcome one to see done. I thought the performance here was really good. As I said, I thought that his plot strand was a really interesting one, and I have to say I was a bit disappointed though that by part 4 he kind of disappeared from the narrative. I thought there was going to be a lot more of this idea of Frobisher becomes a god, the emperor, a living god, and they get a couple of good scenes out of that, and they built the statue to him, and there's the bit where they trial the assassination because the doctors told them not to fake it this time. They actually genuinely try to assassinate Frobisher. That's very well done. But I kind of thought this was going to be a much bigger part of the story than what it was, and I must admit I would have liked a little bit more of Frobisher reforming society, or maybe becoming a little bit corrupt, or doing a few things the Doctor doesn't approve of, and maybe starts to enjoy godhood a little bit too much, or maybe a little bit not enough. I thought that was a very strong plot strand that tapered out before it should have.
Yeah, I think I'm just imagining, Robert Shearman realizing, I've got to get back to the main story here, and he just has to drop that.
Yeah,
which is a shame, because it is quite funny. And just mentioning Shearman again, the sculptor in the scene where they're making the statue, that is actually Robert Shearman.
Oh, okay, I didn't recognise him.
Yeah. It's something I didn't. It's not like I listened to it and thought, I recognise that voice. It's something I read afterwards too, so I'm not all knowing by any means.
Fair enough. What stood out for you as far as the guest cast or the guest characters are concerned?
Look, I think there's some really good voices in here. I mean, the guy who plays Childeric, Lord Childeric, I thought was Paul Darrow. I had to actually go and look it up, and it's not Paul Darrow.
I had exactly the same thought. I was listening to it and going, I would have heard if Paul Darrow was in Big Finish. I'm sure I would have known, because it is very Darrow-esque, yeah.
Super Darrow-esque, he's fantastic. But Sam Kelly, who plays both Eugene Tacitus, the scribe, and also the child, obviously with a little effect on his voice, I thought was just fabulous. I could sort of detect that the child was his voice when I was listening to it, and obviously that becomes a thing later on when the Doctor asks the child, to speak like the adults, lower your voice, and it morphs into much more of Eugene's voice. That was really spooky, and I think the way that Sam Kelly sells it, that Eugene is just this bumbling scribe who, I learned to write from my father and I must have a child somewhere, and seems quite doddery at first, but as all the memories start coming back and he realises what he's done, and the Doctor sort of teases out that he had actually, killed his child in real life, and here we are in this fantasy world where, Eugene is not actually the hero or the god, he's like the scribe that's writing it. I thought, this is very good. And I think Sam Kelly just knocks it out of the park. I completely believed in the character.
Yeah, it's a very strong performance, and he does rise above the work and really adds the work in an effective way. I didn't pick he was voicing the child at the time, but once I knew that it was, and I looked back, I did see how his speech patterns and intonations and the way that, the way that he puts the rhythm to his sentences was the same, and that was a really good piece of acting to be able to do that. I think that his character is obviously fundamental to the story. It's the one in which the story turns, and he does hold it together, and he does make the twists work. And that sense of wondering what's going on, what is this world? How does it work? What is the twist that's going to happen? What are all these clues about? Was what kept me really into the episode. I was sitting there, particularly in part 2, part 3, going, okay, I know something's up here, but is it this? Is it this? The one thing I will criticise a little bit is the clue about all the Bibles going back for centuries being in his handwriting. I just thought was way too big a clue, way too early, because I'm like, okay, so he wrote them all. This guy's clearly too much, and I thought that was probably a little bit too big. That's just me being very, very critical. And also, there's a big deal made about the fact that all the Bibles are exactly the right length of notepad for all the Emperor gods. And I don't think that kind of went anywhere, or did I miss something there?
It's just that I guess it was a construct, and that the story, for want of a better term, would end, you know.
So when he noticed he was getting to the end of a notebook, the world sensed that in his mind and adapted the world to meet that, is, I guess, what we're saying.
Possibly.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Possibly.
Okay, no, that makes sense. I'll go with that. But yeah, look, he made the denouement work, and I won't go any further on that because I think we will talk about that towards the end. So, look, he was a big strength of the episode. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, outside of Eugene, Tacitus, and Lord Childeric, you have some... They're kind of more bit parts, like the Empress and so on.
Yeah, and it's one of the disadvantages, I think, of the Big Finish range, is that sometimes they do fall very quickly into characters pulled off the shelf. And in this case, we did have, like, this guy is a nice, slightly silly upper-class twit, so we're going to give him that voice. And this woman is a scheming young woman, so she gets scheming young woman voice. And this woman's a scheming old woman, so she gets scheming old woman voice. And it was kind of very obvious, like, that's that character, and they sound like this. And, you know, any Big Finish you listen to, a character like that will sound like that.
And possibly played by the same person.
And probably played by the same person, absolutely. And that is something I have noticed about Big Finish as a casual person. You go in and go, oh, there's that character, you know, with that voice. Okay, and I think that they are very by numbers sometimes. And look, all of these people were very good, but outside of, as you said, the Paul Darrow sounding character and Eugene, I thought there was a lot, and Frobisher and the Doctor, obviously, there was a lot of just sort of like generic character.
Yeah. The story is very dark. At least it gets very dark. Starts off quite funny. But when it starts to turn, were you surprised by how dark it got? Like when the child wants to just start killing people. He just starts killing people.
I was surprised at how well it was done. I wasn't surprised that it happened. I think I've watched and listened to enough science fiction over the last 40 years that I know that if a 5-year-old child with a British accent turns up, they're going to start killing people. That's just how science fiction works. But again, even though I was expecting, I was like, oh, at some point you're going to turn on Childeric and you're going to kill him. It's like, no, they've done it in quite a spooky, atmospheric way. So even though I was expecting it, it was done well. Kudos to them for it.
Yeah. Let's leap forward a bit to the elephant in the room, because I really want to talk about it. And that's this world that they're in.
Yes.
I've not done a lot of outside reading on the story, but I would like to think a lot of people out there would see similarities in Heaven Sent to this, insofar as that you have a man trapped in a castle enduring horrible things over and over and over and over again. I think it's incredibly confession dial-like. And in fact, there is a bit which still confuses me, and you might have thoughts on this, but hopefully readers can jump in as well, where I think Frobisher asks what it would look like from the outside or something, and Colin says it would look like a big blue box. And I thought, is he saying it would look like a TARDIS? Is this Time Lord technology? Is Tacitus meant to be a Time Lord? Or am I just projecting too much from shows like Heaven Sent, which have come much later, onto it? Because there are these similarities, and I couldn't make head nor tail of Colin saying it would look like a big blue box.
It's interesting. One of the just things about an audio drama is obviously it leaves the listener to construct things in their mind, sets and worlds and what people look like and all the rest of it. I certainly thought the world building in terms of setting up the culture and the systems and the processes was very, very good. And they had some really good and clever examples, like the staged fake assassination to prove that this guy's immortal. That stood out as a really clever way to establish how this world works and how the wives work and all the rest of it. I thought was very, very good.
And quite funny too.
Yeah, it was funny and enjoyable whilst allowing you to go, okay, so I get how this world works. What I struggled a bit with was I had to adapt my mind's eye image of the physical world as the story went on, because when it first started and they've got big crowd scenes with open sort of things, I was imagining a big outdoors area with big fields and crowds and flags and a village and a castle with a balcony that they're all sort of parading over and all the rest of it. as it sort of went on, I'm like, oh, actually, no, they're all inside. They're all in sort of a big, like, inside sort of town square, inside a castle. And the imagery that I did have at that stage was very heaven sent, that sort of that brickwork and that darkness and all the rest of it. It did go there, but I did find that I needed to adjust my perception of the world as I learned more about it. Now, whether that's just my lack of paying attention to the right bits or the script didn't quite do that, I'm not sure. But I did find that, and that's I guess a natural part of an audio drama.
I think that's very fair. I think until you get more clues, you can't sort of hone it down to what it actually is.
Yeah.
Because what it actually is, I think it's very late in the piece where someone says something about the world outside. And it's like, well, the world outside, what? There is no world outside. It's just the castle.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, that's like when the penny dropped for me. That might be in like the 3rd episode or something, maybe even the 4th episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I hear what you're saying there.
So look, a couple of just random thoughts. There were some very nice little witty bits of writing in there. There was definitely some allusions to other cult television. One of the characters is named Sejanus out of I, Claudius. There are allusions to the character of Catagia from Babylon 5, which would have been, right in its prime at the stage this was written. And indeed, at one stage, somebody does refer to a shining beacon of hope, which is straight out of the Babylon 5 opening dialogue. So that was good. Big praise for the cliffhangers. They were all really good and really engaging. And for an audio drama, they sold the dramatic nature of them very, very well. And Colin particularly, he's a star cliffhanger actor, and he does it very well. I really was engaged by the idea of, everything being faked and how much everybody was in on it. And look, I will just make the comment that these early Big Finishes especially are not just overwritten, not just overlong, but are still learning the skill of how do you paint a world in audio. And it was still full, particularly in the first part, of a lot of very clunky lines, who's that over there? Oh, why? It's an old man. He looks very old. Or, what are you doing? I'm just putting my spectacles on. I'm doing it very slowly. Like, literally, that's not an exaggeration. And I sort of thought, look, I know that they get better at that, but even at this stage, there's some very clunky dialogue sort of building those up there. They're the only little points I have before we talk about the conclusion. Anything from you, Rob, before we go there?
I'd like to say something about, how this is a commentary on not just religion, but systems and bureaucracy in some ways. I think there's some great commentary on bureaucracy. Something had to be signed off in triplicate and on different coloured pieces of paper and all of this sort of stuff. It was like there was a Douglas Adams video game called Bureaucracy. It reminded me of that in places. The writing kind of felt a little Adamsy at times. Not completely Adamsy, but a little Adamsy, a little funny. And the bureaucracy moments really reminded me of Bureaucracy, the video game.
Yeah, look, I think it's really interesting. I think the way that it commented on the way that systems develop and just start to occur because they've always occurred is really interesting. And if I can compare it to an example from real life this week, in fact, anybody who's particularly in Australia would know that you go back to the 70s and 80s when we had the old Parliament House. There was a thing called doors where, as the politicians, including the Prime Minister back in those days, would walk up to the front door of Parliament, journos would be there with a microphone and say, do you have any comment on? And they'll do a quick sort of doorstop press conference. That has sort of evolved over time to when I first started working at the Australian Parliament. Doors is now a thing where a camera is set up and some MPs will literally arrive, go into their office, put their tie on, do their hair, and then go back out to go and speak to the camera at doors, to do doors.
Yes.
And because of COVID and we can't sort of do all this stuff now, they've set up a big sort of isolated microphone and camera in the mural hall in the middle of the second floor, which is nowhere near, it's about as far from a door as you can physically get in the building. And as my boss actually had to do this yesterday, and as we were walking up there, he sort of said, give it 5 years, there are going to be people who are going to be calling this thing doors and wondering why we do that, because it's nowhere near a door, but we'll just keep doing it because that's what we've always done. And yes. So this is a real commentary, and this is exactly what the episode was talking about.
Precisely right. Yeah, good observation, actually.
So, Rob, you asked me to go first on the climax. Having praised a lot in this story, I am not going to praise the climax. I had a couple of problems with it. The first was that the Doctor was less involved than I thought he should be. The second was that Frobisher wasn't involved at all, which was a shame, because I enjoyed his subplot and I enjoyed his character. I thought it was very talky. There was a lot of, I'm now doing this, I'm now stopping this, he's doing that, he's doing that. It was sort of like just a very talky sort of thing, and there was lots of just explaining the plot to each other, like, I did this, and then I did this, and this happened because this happened, and look, I get it's an audio, but I was let down by that, and particularly given that I've praised and really enjoyed all these clues and all this world building, and I'm wondering who's in on the deception and who's not and all the rest of it, and then for a kind of none of that to actually be relevant, and it was just all about this one guy. Look, that's an interesting bit of drama, and I get the drama of this whole world is actually just about this kind of broken, sad man. But I did think, having done so much that I've enjoyed... Look, let me put it this way. The things that I enjoyed most about the story were irrelevant to the ending, and that was a shame for me.
I hear what you're saying. I think that's very fair. It does get talky towards the end. I think they're just trying to explain how the child is turning the knife back on Eugene. And I think the Doctor and Frobisher was like saying, no, don't do it. And I'm thinking, why don't they just grab... It's just a little child. Why don't they grab the knife? Why don't they grab the child? And I think one of them says, I'm trying to grab the knife, but my hand is going straight through them. Look at that. And it's another example of exposition. But at least it was explaining the question that was in my head, like, why aren't you just grabbing this kid? You know, he can't be that big. You know, there's a line earlier in the story where Colin's like, you know, I can just run away from you. I've just run up these stairs because you've got tiny, short little legs, sort of thing. So clearly what we're meant to be imagining is a child who's not very big or capable. And yet we're meant to be thinking that he's doing this murder of Eugene. I thought that was, you know, a necessary bit of exposition to have. But in general, yeah, there is a rug pull for almost 3 episodes. You're imagining this world and this weird structure, and, you know, they believe in things just because they've always believed in these things and stuff. And then the big rug pull is that it's just Eugene's world, and that he is actually mad and killed his kid. Yeah. And it gets very bloody dark.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, Rob. And I think, you know, rug pulls, when they work for you, are a wonderful dramatic device. And I think there will be people listening to this going, what do you mean, Dave? This was a wonderful, like, surprise and a rug pull, and it twisted the whole story. And that's fine. If it landed for you, that's great. I totally get why it would, but it pulled out from under me the bits I really liked, and that was a shame.
Yeah, well, look, I went with the rug pull, but I can totally see why you would feel that way. Absolutely.
Oh, I'm glad you did.
You've invested a lot over 3 episodes.
Over 2.5 hours nearly, come on.
Yeah.
No, I'm both pleased, but genuinely interested that, yeah, it did land so differently for the two of us.
Look, we've had some listeners write in about the story. Should we get on to their thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, the first one is from Alex Wilcock. He's at Alex Wilcock on Twitter, except here he's emailed us, so hello, Alex. He says, hello. Just saw What's Up Next, and as it's an especial favourite of mine, which I really ought to listen to again as it's been a while, the lying blasphemer speaks the truth, Your Majesty. Absolutely superb. Still one of the best things Big Finish have done. Maybe only Rob's own Jubilee beats it for me. And this TARDIS team just sings. Both Colin and Robert are so good, and I wish we'd had more of them together. But it's a terrific cast all round. Sam Kelly really is the pivot around which this slides, from hilarious to heartrendingly horrifying. But most of all, Roberta Taylor as Berengaria. She is the perfect proper 60s era guest star, as a big soap name star that people would say stunt casting before they heard it, and oh wow afterwards. Now I'll pause there and say, I don't recognise her name at all, but obviously in the UK she must be a soapy type person.
No, it went over my head as well, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Since I was a very small boy, first watching Doctor Who, existential crises and warped religion have really done it for me, and this is one of the finest ever told for both. It also feels like part of a theme between Castrovalva and the Pandorica Opens, where Doctor Who explicitly plays with writers and creations, though unlike Moffat's underlying "aren't writers the loveliest things in the universe," the message here is writers are utter bastards. Almost anything you can say about this is a spoiler, but as I assume you're going to go into details, you could give it an alternate title from infamous advice to writers: kill your babies. And speaking of Moffat, this is very much a confession dial in a castle, and over again for just one man, but on the upside, with a very different crucial bird, while on the downside, no way out. Love and liberty from Alex.
That's a really good summation there, Alex. And again, some things that we agreed on and some things that landed a bit differently for you as well, which is good.
Yeah, and that confession dial thing came up again as well, which I see absolutely in there.
Yeah, absolutely. We have an email from Will Sanger. Thank you for writing in, Will. He writes, "Hi Rob and Dave. Enjoyed your episode on cool Doctor Who spaceships and thought you had some great picks. But I'm really glad to see you diving into Big Finish. The last few years, as the series itself has, in my opinion, been declining during the Jodie Whittaker era, and my own enjoyment of the show declining in the current era, I have managed to find a lot of enjoyment in the show elsewhere, with Big Finish producing some better quality storytelling in my view. The older Big Finish stories are definitely the better stories, with more creativity and risks being taken and with more routes available to explore new stories. Whereas now it can feel like they are scrambling for new stories to tell, especially with the Eighth Doctor, when there is so much they've done with his character. However, even if they aren't as strong, I still find a huge amount of immense excitement from the modern Big Finish releases. I'm really glad the Holy Terror got picked, as it's one of my favourite Big Finish stories. Rob Shearman for me is one of the best ever Doctor Who writers, up there with Robert Holmes, Terence Dix, Malcolm Hulke, Stephen Moffat and Paul Cornell. That's some august company, but look, he's a good writer, can't disagree. The way the Holy Terror explores the societal consequences of religious extremism is very powerful, with a society that follows traditional rituals of death and conflict with complete obedience to one leader, and nobody ever questions their beliefs or truly understands the nature of free will. Furthermore, nobody really believes in the faith anymore, but they follow the rituals out of tradition and fear regardless. It's a very well structured and thematically powerful story and script, and is, in my opinion, a great story. Plus, the bonkers nature of Frobisher as a companion and concept is just fun, and has one of my favourite Sixth Doctor quotes: "It doesn't matter who the cruelty is directed towards, the cruelty itself is wrong." Keep up the good work, Will Sanger. Well, I agree with everything you said there about the society and what was going on. It's a shame the resolution wasn't
wanted
about
that to be real.
I wanted that to be real, and I wanted that to be what the denouement was about. And that's probably my biggest problem with the story.
Interesting. And finally, a quick tweet from our good friend Rob Kelly at Rob Kelly Tweets. "I listened to this in preparation for the Doctor Who show's review. I wouldn't say it was the best Big Finish story ever made, but I really enjoyed it. It had an excellent score and many good moments. Colin Baker is amazing in everything he does for Doctor Who."
Nothing I disagree with there. Thank you, Rob.
Fantastic.